You know, when we think about ancient Rome, we usually picture the grandeur of the Colosseum under the blazing sun, senators debating in the Forum, or merchants hawking their wares in bustling marketplaces. But have you ever wondered what happened when darkness fell over those ancient streets tonight? As you settle into comfort, let me tell you about the nocturnal world of Rome, a world quite different from the one we imagine. The streets that gleamed with marble by day transformed into something else entirely once the sun dipped below the 7 hills. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's walk together through those shadowy lanes, where the night belonged to a very particular cast of characters. The evening began as it always did in the 4th year of Emperor Hadrian's reign, with the gradual dimming of light across the city. Marcus Tullius, a freedman who kept a modest lamp oil shop near the suburban district, was just closing his shutters when he heard the familiar sound of iron-shod boots on stone. The vigils were beginning their rounds. These were Rome's night watchmen, part firefighters, part police, and they were among the first to claim the streets after sunset. Marcus nodded to the squadron leader, a grizzled man named Gaius who had served in the vigils for 15 years. "Quiet night, I hope," Marcus said, securing the last shutter. Gaius smiled wearily. "In Rome never truly quiet, my friend. Never truly quiet." As Marcus made his way home through the narrow alleyways, he passed other figures emerging like nocturnal creatures. There was old Lucia, a midwife who carried her leather bag of instruments and herbs. She walked with purpose, heading toward the insulae where a young mother had sent for her hours ago. Childbirth respected no clock, and Lucia had long ago accepted that her life would be lived as much in darkness as in light. She knew these streets better than most, every loose paving stone, every corner where one had to watch for emptied chamber pots. The night was her domain as much as anyone's, and she moved through it with the confidence of long familiarity. You see, Roman law actually forbade most wheeled vehicles from entering the city during daylight hours. Can you imagine this meant that as soon as the sun set, the streets began to rumble and clatter with the sound of carts, wagons, and carriages making their deliveries. The night belonged to commerce as much as it did to watchmen and healers. Heavy ox carts laden with grain from Ostia, wine amphoras from the countryside, building materials for the endless construction projects that characterized Rome's expansion, all of these rolled through the streets in an almost constant procession. The drivers, rough men who knew every back street and shortcut, first at their animals and at each other, their torches casting wild shadows on the walls of tenement buildings. Near the warehouses by the Tiber, a young man named Quintus was overseeing the unloading of olive oil from Hispania. He was a vicarius, a slave manager, but one with considerable responsibility and, truth be told, more freedom than many freeborn Romans who lived in poverty. The work was hard, the hours were long, but Quintus found a strange peace in the nighttime rhythm of the docks. The torchlight on the water, the songs the workers sang to coordinate their lifting, the smell of the river mixing with the scent of exotic goods from across the empire. By day, the docks were chaotic, overwhelming. By night, there was an order to the chaos, a purpose that felt almost meditative. He watched as amphora after amphora was carefully rolled off the barge, each one representing someone's livelihood, someone's profit, someone's meal. In the suburb, the city's most densely populated and notorious district, a different kind of night was unfolding. The taverns were in full swing, despite laws that technically prohibited them from operating after certain hours. These laws, like so many in Rome, were enforced selectively and sporadically. Inside the Thermopolium owned by a Greek freedwoman named Theodora, a dozen patrons crowded around rough wooden tables, drinking wine that had been watered down to varying degrees depending on how much one paid. There was Rufus, a construction worker whose back ached from hauling stones all day. There was Decimus, a scribe who came here to forget the tedium of copying contracts. There was even young Appius, barely 17, who should have been home but was instead losing his week's earnings at dice. Theodora moved between the tables with practiced ease, filling cups, breaking up arguments before they became fights, listening to confessions and complaints with the patience of someone who had heard it all before. She had got her freedom 8 years ago and this tavern 3 years after that. The night shift was harder, rougher, but also more profitable. People spent more freely after dark, as if the absence of sunlight loosened the purse strings of prudence. She had learned to read the signs of trouble, when to call for help, when to personally escort someone to the door. Her establishment had a reputation for being relatively safe, relatively honest, and in the suburb, that counted for something. Outside, the street prostitutes were beginning their work. They stood in doorways and at corners, some wearing the toga required by law for their profession, others dressed in ways that skirted the regulations. There was Julia, who had once been a slave in a wealthy household until her master's debts forced the sale of all his property, including her. There was Melissa, a Greek woman who sent most of her earnings to support her family in Athens. There was young Felix, a male prostitute who catered to a different clientele, one that preferred to conduct its business under cover of darkness. They called out to passers-by, their voices ranging from seductive to desperate depending on how the night was going, how many customers they had already seen, how much they still needed to earn. Now, I want you to understand something about these night workers. History often treats them as mere footnotes, statistics, or moral lessons, but they were people, individuals with hopes and fears and daily concerns just like anyone else. They weren't monsters or angels, just humans trying to navigate a world that offered them limited choices. A magistrate named Lucius Flavius was being carried through the streets in his litter, borne by 4 sturdy slaves. The curtains were partially drawn, allowing him to observe the night city while maintaining some privacy. He was returning from a dinner party at the home of a fellow senator, a gathering that had lasted well past sunset. Through the gap in the curtains, he watched the nocturnal Rome unfold. The vigils on their patrol, checking for fires and illegal activity. The carts rumbling past with their heavy loads. The tavern dwellers spilling into the streets. The shadowy transactions in doorways and alleys. This was a realm that most of his class preferred to pretend didn't exist, or at least didn't acknowledge in polite company. His litter-bearers navigated the obstacles with practiced skill. They knew to avoid certain streets where the risk of robbery was higher. They knew which corners the vigils preferred to patrol and which they avoided. They knew where the pavement was treacherous and where the nighttime traffic was most congested. These men carried their masters through the dark hours regularly, and they had developed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of nocturnal Rome. Their names were Marius, Titus, Sergius, and young Hanno, who had arrived from Africa only 2 years earlier. They barely spoke to each other as they walked, each man focused on maintaining the rhythm and balance of their burden, but they were a team in the truest sense, each one anticipating the other's movements. In a different part of the city, near the Silian Hill, a baker named Gaius Cornelius was already at work. Most people don't realize this, but bakeries began their work in the deepest part of the night so that fresh bread would be available at first light. Gaius had inherited the business from his father, and his father before him, and the rhythm of nocturnal baking was in his blood. The heat from the ovens was intense, making the bakery feel like a small pocket of summer even on the coldest winter nights. His apprentices, few sleepy teenagers and an older slave who had been with the family for decades, worked alongside him in comfortable silence. The smell of baking bread filled the street, a warm and welcoming scent that contrasted with some of the less pleasant odors that characterized urban Rome. There was a meditation in the work, in the kneading of dough, in the careful feeding of the oven, in the watching and waiting to pull the loaves at exactly the right moment. Gaius found that he preferred these quiet hours to the busy morning rush when customers crowded his shop, demanding and impatient. Here in the darkness, with only the oven's glow for company, he could think, reflect, remember. He thought about his daughter, recently married and moved to Pompeii with her new husband. He thought about his own mortality and who would inherit this bakery when he was gone. He thought about the small things that make up a life, the daily bread that was both his livelihood and, in a strange way, his poetry. You're probably getting sleepy now, and that's good. Let your mind drift along with these stories, these people moving through the ancient darkness. There's a rhythm to the night, isn't there, a different pace than the day? The vigil's patrol continued through the narrow streets. Their night was divided into watches, and they moved in squadrons, each responsible for a particular district. Gaius, the squadron leader we met earlier, was checking the ground floors of insulae for fire hazards, the most common and most feared disaster in Rome. These apartment buildings, often poorly constructed and overcrowded, could become death traps when fire broke out. The vigils carried buckets and hooks, pumps and axes. They had the authority to break down doors if they suspected fire, to order buildings evacuated, to punish those who violated fire safety regulations. It was a serious responsibility, one that Gaius took seriously. He had seen too many people die in fires, had pulled too many charred bodies from collapsed buildings. The night was not just his workplace, it was his battlefield. On the Aventine Hill, in a modest but respectable house, a philosopher named Marcus Aurelius Secundus sat in his study, a single oil lamp providing light. He was not related to the emperor, despite sharing the name, but he was a respected teacher of Stoic philosophy. The night was his time for writing, for thinking, for the correspondence that connected him to other philosophers across the empire. By day, he taught students and received clients. By night, he belonged to himself and to his thoughts. He was working on a treatise about the nature of virtue, trying to articulate ideas that felt crystal clear in his mind but became frustratingly elusive when he tried to capture them in words. The silence of the night helped, the way the world seemed to shrink down to just him and the papyrus and the small circle of lamplight. His slave, an educated Greek man named Aristoteles, brought him warmed wine and a small plate of cheese and bread. They exchanged a few words about the text, for Aristoteles was literate and often served as a sounding board for ideas. Their relationship was complicated, as many such relationships were. Aristoteles was property, legally no different from the furniture, but he was also a conversation partner, an intellectual companion, someone whose opinion Secundus valued. It was one of the many contradictions of Roman life, the way profound inequality coexisted with genuine human connection. When Aristoteles left the room, Secundus sat for a moment thinking about this paradox, then returned to his writing. Down by the river, the night fishermen were at work. These were free men mostly, Romans of modest means who supplemented their income by fishing the Tiber after dark. The fish they caught, mostly eels and carp, would be sold at the morning markets. The work was cold and often unrewarding, but there was a camaraderie among the fishermen, a shared understanding of what it meant to work while others slept. They called to each other across the water, sharing information about where the fish were biting, warning about snags and dangerous currents. Some of them lived their entire lives on this rhythm, sleeping during the day, working through the night, existing in a kind of parallel Rome that never quite synchronized with the daylight world. Among them was old Tiberius, who claimed to have been fishing the river for 40 years. He knew the Tiber's moods, could read the water like other men read scrolls. He knew when floods were coming, where the fish congregated in different seasons, where the currents were treacherous. The younger fishermen respected him, sought his advice, listened to his stories of the river's history. He had seen emperors come and go, wars and peace, prosperity and famine, and through it all, the river flowed and the fish swam, and men like him cast their nets into the dark water. In the Jewish quarter, beyond the Tiber in the Trastevere district, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah was conducting a late-night study session with several of his advanced students. The Jewish community in Rome kept its own rhythms, following religious laws that sometimes set them apart from their Roman neighbors. The night study of sacred texts was a tradition, a time when the distractions of daily life fell away and one could focus on deeper questions. The young men debated interpretations of Scripture, their voices rising and falling in a pattern that was part argument, part music. The rabbi listened more than he spoke, occasionally offering a guiding question or a new perspective to consider. This was teaching as he understood it, not the imparting of fixed knowledge but the cultivation of questioning minds. His wife, Sarah, appeared briefly with refreshments, wine, and dried figs and nuts. She smiled at the serious faces bent over texts and scrolls, remembering when her husband had been one of those earnest young students. She worried about him sometimes, about the hours he kept, the intensity with which he approached his work. But she also understood that this was his calling, his purpose. She left the men to their studies and returned to her own work, for she was finishing a piece of weaving that had been commissioned by a wealthy client. Her fingers moved almost automatically over the loom, the night's quiet allowing her to work without the interruptions of daytime, when children needed attention and neighbors stopped by and 1,000 small tasks demanded her time. Let your breathing slow now, deep and easy, as we continue our walk through these ancient streets. Feel yourself becoming part of the night, just another soul moving through the darkness. A group of young aristocrats was making its way drunkenly through the streets, singing and shouting. These were the sons of senators and equestrians, young men with too much money and too little supervision. They had been drinking at a private party and were now looking for entertainment, which often meant trouble. They harassed a prostitute who wisely ignored them, knocked over a cart carrying pottery, causing the driver to shout curses after them, and generally behaved as if the city belonged to them, which, in a sense, it did. Their slaves followed at a discreet distance, ready to intervene if things went too far, to pay off anyone who might complain, to ensure their masters got home safely despite their best efforts to the contrary. The vigiles watched but didn't intervene. These young men were protected by birth and connections, and unless they did something truly egregious, it was better to let them pass. Gaius had learned this lesson early in his career, when he had tried to arrest the son of a praetor for setting fire to a beggar's blanket as a joke. The complaint had been dismissed, and Gaius had received a formal reprimand. So now he watched and waited, making sure the aristocratic rebellers moved on, making sure they didn't actually hurt anyone, but otherwise maintaining a careful distance. It was one of the compromises that made urban life possible, an unspoken agreement about who had power and who didn't, who could break rules and who couldn't. A letter carrier named Publius was making his rounds. The imperial postal system operated around the clock, and Publius had the night shift for his sector. He carried letters and documents in a leather satchel, each one carefully sealed and marked with its destination. Some were official government correspondence, bearing the emperor's seal. Others were private letters, merchants conducting business, families staying in touch across the empire's vast distances. Publius couldn't read most of the contents, but he took his responsibility seriously. He knew that these pieces of papyrus and parchment contained important information, expressions of love, notices of death, contracts, and agreements. He was a small part of the enormous administrative machine that held the empire together, and he took pride in that. He walked miles every night, his route taking him from the Esquiline to the Quirinal, up and down hills, through forums and markets, past temples and baths. He knew Rome in a way that few others did, seeing it at all hours, in all weather. He had delivered letters during thunderstorms, during the oppressive heat of summer nights, during winter snow that was rare but not unknown in Rome. His feet ached constantly, and he had long ago lost count of how many sandals he had worn through, but the work was steady and the pay was reliable, and in a city where many lived hand to mouth, that was not nothing. In a small insula apartment near the Circus Maximus, a widow named Claudia was sitting up with her sick child. The boy, maybe 6 years old, had a fever that had been raging for 2 days. She bathed his forehead with cool water, whispered prayers to the household gods, and tried not to give in to the fear that gnawed at her. She had already lost one child to fever 3 years ago, and the memory of that loss was a wound that had never fully healed. Her neighbor, an older woman named Livia, had come to sit with her, offering comfort and distraction in equal measure. They talked quietly about small things, neighborhood gossip, the price of bread, anything to keep Claudia from spiraling into panic. This was one of the gifts of urban life, the way neighbors became family, the way people looked out for each other because survival often depended on it. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped, and many of Rome's homeless population sought shelter wherever they could find it. In the porticos of public buildings, in the archways of the aqueducts, in any corner that offered some protection from the elements, people huddled together sharing body heat and watching over their meager possessions. These were the truly invisible citizens of Rome, the ones who had fallen through all the social safety nets, who had no family to take them in, no patron to provide support, no trade to earn a living. Some were veterans whose service had been forgotten. Some were former slaves cast out when they became too old or sick to work. Some were simply the unlucky ones who had encountered more misfortune than they could bear. Among them tonight was a man named Nias who had once been a successful merchant. Bad investments and worse luck had destroyed his business, his debts had consumed his property, and his friends had melted away when his fortune disappeared. He had been living on the streets for 2 years now, and he had learned the rules of survival in this harsh world. He knew where the vigiles were lenient and where they were harsh. He knew which bakeries might spare some old bread, which taverns might look the other way if he slept in their doorway. He knew that the night was dangerous but also protective, that the darkness could hide you from those who might harm you. He was 43 years old and looked 60. His teeth were loose, his body was thin, but he was alive, and some nights that felt like a victory in itself. Perhaps you're drifting now, floating between sleep and waking, the ancient city becoming dreamlike, less distinct. That's perfect. Let it blur. Let it soften. A doctor named Thessalis was being summoned to the home of a wealthy banker who had fallen ill suddenly after dinner. Thessalis was Greek, as most doctors in Rome were, and he had built a successful practice treating the Roman elite. He traveled at night frequently, for illness respected no schedule, and he had grown accustomed to being awakened at all hours. He brought his medical kit, containing instruments, herbs, potions, and the knowledge accumulated through years of study and practice. Medicine in Rome was a mixture of practical observation, traditional remedies, and theoretical frameworks inherited from Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. Thessalis himself tried to be rational and empirical in his approach, but he also knew that his patients expected a certain amount of theater, impressive sound in terminology, and confident pronouncements. His young apprentice, A Roman boy named Quintus Fabius accompanied him. The boy was eager but squeamish, wincing at the sight of blood, hesitating before cutting abscesses. Thessalos wondered sometimes if the boy would make it through his training, but he remembered his own early discomfort with the messy reality of medical work. Teaching, he had learned, was as much about patience as knowledge. As they walked through the dark streets, guided by the servants of the sick man, Thessalos quizzed his apprentice on symptoms and treatments, using the walk as an impromptu lesson. The night became a classroom, the city itself a text to be studied and interpreted. The public baths had closed hours ago, but the staff was still at work. The furnaces that heated the water needed to be maintained, the pools needed to be cleaned, repairs needed to be made. A stoker named Cassius spent his nights feeding coal and wood into the hypocaust furnaces, his body covered in sweat and soot despite the cool night air outside. It was brutal work, hot and exhausting, but it paid better than many other forms of labor, and Cassius had learned to find a kind of meditation in the repetitive rhythm of it. Shovel, feed, stoke, repeat. His mind could wander while his body worked, and he thought about his plans to save enough money to buy his aging mother a better place to live, somewhere with more light and less noise than the Insula apartment where she currently lived. In the temple of Vesta, the Vestal virgins maintained their eternal vigil over the sacred flame. These priestesses, chosen as young girls and sworn to 30 years of service and celibacy, held one of the most important religious positions in Rome. The sacred flame could never be allowed to go out, for it symbolized the eternal nature of Rome itself. The night watch was rotated among them, and tonight it was the responsibility of a young Vestal named Fulvia, barely 2 years into her service. She sat in the quiet temple, watching the flame, occasionally adding fuel, and thinking about the life she had left behind and the life that stretched ahead of her. 28 more years of this. 28 more years before she would be free to leave, to marry if she chose, to live a normal life. Sometimes it felt like an eternity, but she took comfort in the honor of her position, the respect she commanded, the knowledge that she served Rome in a sacred capacity. The night wore on, moving toward its deepest point, that hour when the darkness seems most complete and the morning most distant. This was when time felt strange, when the boundary between yesterday and tomorrow became blurred. The cart drivers continued their endless rounds. The vigils continued their patrols. The bakers continued their work. The fishermen continued to cast their nets. The prostitutes continued to wait for customers. The drunks continued to stumble. The sick continued to suffer. The homeless continued to huddle in doorways. Rome continued to live and breathe and function even in the absence of the sun. A night soil collector named Spurius was doing the work that nobody wanted to acknowledge but everyone depended on. He and his crew emptied chamber pots and cesspits, hauling away the waste that accumulated in a city of over 1 million people. It was disgusting work, work that marked you as belonging to the lowest rung of the social ladder, but it was necessary work, and it paid just enough to survive. Spurius had been born into this profession, as his father and grandfather had been before him. He had known nothing else, and he had long ago stopped hoping for anything different. His children would likely follow the same path, for social mobility in Rome, while not impossible, was difficult for those at the very bottom. He worked through the night because the work had to be done but was best done when most people were asleep and wouldn't have to witness or smell it. Your eyelids are heavy now, aren't they? Your body is relaxed, sinking deeper into comfort. The ancient night surrounds you like a gentle embrace. A group of astrologers and fortune-tellers had set up their impromptu businesses in a corner of the Forum Boreum. These practitioners of what might be called alternative knowledge operated in a legal gray area, sometimes tolerated, sometimes persecuted, depending on the political climate and the mood of the authorities. Tonight they sat at small tables, reading fortunes from stars, from patterns of thrown bones, from the lines on palms. Their customers were mostly ordinary Romans, people looking for guidance, for hope, for some sense that their lives had meaning and direction. There was Antioch, an Egyptian who read omens in patterns of oil on water. There was Helena, who claimed to channel the spirits of the dead. There was Marius, who interpreted dreams and charged extra for predicting lottery numbers. They were charlatans, perhaps, but they provided something that people needed, a sense of possibility, of connection to forces larger than themselves. A young woman named Prima approached Helena's table. She wanted to know if her soldier husband, stationed in Britannia, was safe and faithful. Helena took her hand, closed her eyes, made a show of consulting spirits, and then told Prima what she wanted to hear, that her husband was well and thought of her constantly. Was it true? Helena had no idea. But she saw the relief in Prima's face, the way her shoulders relaxed, and she felt that she had provided a service worth the few coins Prima placed on the table. Sometimes, Helena thought, hope was more valuable than truth. In the Jewish synagogue in Trastevere, the night study session was winding down. The young scholars were yawning now, their debates losing the sharp focus they had earlier. Rabbi Eliezer dismissed them with blessings and instructions for what to study next. They filed out into the night, pulling their cloaks tight against the chill, heading to their homes to snatch a few hours of sleep before the new day began. The rabbi remained behind for a few moments, tidying the scrolls, straightening the benches, enjoying the quiet that descended after the young men's energetic discussions. He said a final prayer and blew out the lamps, then stepped into the night himself, walking the familiar path to his home where Sarah would be waiting, where his own bed called to him with promises of rest. The aristocratic revelers had finally run out of energy and were being escorted home by their long-suffering slaves. One of them had gotten into a minor fight and sported a black eye, which would require some creative explaining in the morning. Another had lost a considerable sum of money gambling with a dice player who was much more skilled, or perhaps just more sober. A third was vomiting in an alley while his slave held his toga out of the way and waited patiently for the episode to pass. This was a familiar ritual, one that would be repeated the next night and the night after that, for these young men had not yet learned, if they ever would, that privilege came with responsibilities, not just rights. Gaius Cornelius the baker was pulling the first loaves from his oven, the bread perfectly golden and crusty. The smell filled the street, and even at this late hour, a few early customers were beginning to appear. The delivery slaves from wealthy households, sent to secure the freshest bread before it was all sold. The workers heading to early shifts who would grab a loaf to eat throughout the day. The smell of fresh bread was one of the defining characteristics of Roman Dawn, and Gaius took pride in being part of that, in knowing that his work fed the city, that his family had been feeding the city for generations. His eldest apprentice, a boy named Lucius, was showing real promise. The boy had a feel for the dough, could sense when it needed more kneading, when it was ready to bake. Gaius was thinking about teaching him the secret family recipe for the special honey cakes they made for festivals. It was a small thing, but it represented trust, the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. This was how traditions survived, how families maintained their identities across time. Not through grand gestures but through small acts of teaching and learning, repeated night after night, year after year. The Tiber fishermen were hauling in their nets for the last time, sorting through the catch, keeping what was saleable and throwing back what wasn't. Old Tiberius had done well tonight, several good-sized deals that would fetch a decent price. He packed them carefully in wet cloth and prepared to head to the market as soon as it opened. His joints ached with the night's work, with the damp air from the river, with the accumulation of 40 years of this labor. But there was also satisfaction, the satisfaction of a job done, of providing for oneself through honest work, of being part of the city's vast network of trade and commerce. The first light was beginning to show on the eastern horizon now, not yet sunrise but the promise of it. The darkness was beginning to lift, slowly, suddenly. This was the transition time, when night workers prepared to rest and day workers prepared to rise. The city never truly slept, but it did change its rhythm, shifting from the nocturnal patterns to the diurnal ones. Sleep is very close now, right at the edge of your awareness. You can feel it pulling you gently down into peaceful rest. Marcus Tullius, the lamp oil merchant we met at the beginning of this journey, was waking from a night's sleep. He splashed water on his face, said morning prayers to the household gods, and prepared to open his shop for another day. He had no memory of the dream he just had, something about walking through endless streets looking for something he couldn't name. He dressed in his tunic, ate a quick breakfast of bread and cheese that his wife had prepared, and stepped into the early morning air. The night people were fading away, becoming invisible again. The day people were emerging, and Rome was transforming once more. The Vigils squadron under Gaius was completing their final round before the ship change. They were tired, ready for food and sleep, but they maintained their discipline to the end. Gaius filed his report with the centurion, noting the evening's incidents: 3 small fires extinguished, 2 fights broken up, 1 theft reported, a typical night in Rome, which was to say, a night of constant small dramas that somehow coalesced into the larger drama of urban life. He walked home as the sun rose, greeting other vigils who were just beginning their day shifts. His wife would have breakfast ready. His children would be just waking. He would eat, sleep through the morning and afternoon, and then return to do it all again when darkness fell. The prostitutes were packing up, those who had places to go retreating to their rooms to count the night's earnings and assess the night's damages. Julia had made enough to pay her rent and buy food for another few days. Melissa had not done as well and was worried about how she would make ends meet. Felix had a regular client who had paid handsomely and promised to return next week. These were the calculations of survival, the daily arithmetic of life at the margins. Lucia the midwife was finally heading home after successfully delivering a healthy baby boy. Mother and child were doing well, and Lucia felt the satisfaction she always felt after a successful birth, the sense that she had helped bring new life into the world, that her skills had made a difference. She was exhausted but content, already thinking about her own bed, her own rest, before the next call would come, as it inevitably would. The homeless were stirring from their shelters, preparing to face another day of hustling for food, looking for work, avoiding trouble. Nias folded the cloth that served as his blanket and tucked it into a hidden spot where he could retrieve it tonight. He set out walking, not sure where he was going, just moving because that's what you did. You kept moving. You stayed visible enough to not be forgotten but invisible enough to not be targeted. Claudia's son's fever had broken in the night, and he was sleeping peacefully now. She sat watching him, tears of relief streaming down her face. Her neighbor Olivia had left just before dawn, exhausted but glad that the crisis had passed. Claudia whispered thanks to every god she could think of, making promises about offerings and sacrifices, though she wasn't sure she could afford to keep those promises. But in that moment, with her son breathing easily, with the worst seeming to have passed, she would have promised anything. Dr. Thessalis had diagnosed the sick banker with food poisoning, prescribed a regimen of fasting and herbal remedies, and collected his substantial fee. His apprentice had managed not to faint, which Thessalis considered progress. They walked home through streets that were now bustling with morning activity, and Thessalis quizzed the boy on what they had observed and done, turning the night's work into a lesson that would be reinforced through repetition and discussion. "You're almost asleep now, just barely holding on to consciousness. Let go." It's safe to let go. The Vestal Virgin Fulvia was relieved from her watch by another priestess, and she made her way to her cell for a few hours of sleep before her other duties would claim her. The sacred flame continued to burn, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries more, indifferent to the human dramas playing out around it. In his modest house, Marcus Aurelius Secundus the philosopher finally put down his stylus, his treatise on virtue no closer to completion but a few new ideas sketched out on papyrus. He blew out his lamp as dawn light began filtering through the window. Aristoteles appeared to help him to bed, and Secundus realized with some surprise that he had worked through the entire night. He was getting too old for this, he thought, but he also knew he would do it again, that the pull of ideas, the desire to understand and explain, would always be stronger than the need for sleep. The synagogue was quiet now, the scholars gone, the rabbi sleeping. But the texts remained, the questions remained, the endless conversation between past and present that defined the scholarly tradition. Tomorrow night, or perhaps the night after, there would be another study session, more debates, more questions, the tradition carrying forward. In thousands of insulae across the city, in rooms that were cramped and dark and poorly ventilated, people were waking, beginning their days, stepping into the sunlight. The night shift was ending. The day shift was beginning. Rome was transitioning from one mode to another, like a great beast changing its posture. The cart drivers who had labored through the night were parking their vehicles in warehouses and stables, unhitching their oxen, heading to their own beds. The streets would be quieter now for a few hours before the daytime traffic of pedestrians and litters and official vehicles filled them again. Publius the letter carrier completed his final delivery, a message to a government official that had been marked urgent. He handed it to the official's doorkeeper, confirmed the delivery in his ledger, and finally turned his steps toward home. His feet throbbed with every step, but he was done, his duty discharged until the next nightfall. The astrologers and fortune-tellers packed up their tables and tools, dispersing into the city like smoke. They would return tonight or perhaps tomorrow night.